Welcome to Pod Street, the podcast for Writing WA, the peak body in which we talk to writers, creators, and wonderful people about their projects and progress and recently celebrated books. Today, we are talking with Viki Cramer, author of The Memory of Trees, which has recently been shortlisted for the Book of the Year prize in the 2024 WA Premier's Book Awards. Viki, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Laurie. I'm really happy to be here.
Now, you're a PhD trained ecologist. Talk us through what first led you into the world of ecology, and then I guess more specifically into the study of flora, and particularly eucalypts.
Well, I have a memory of sort of walking around in the bush near where I lived when I was in my late teens. And that was kind of at the time when I was deciding, what I was going to do when I went off to university. And I really wanted to do something to do with nature. But I didn't really know what to do. Like, neither of my parents had been to university. They both left school when they were at year 10. And I was living in a tiny little mining town in North Queensland to the west of Mackay. And so there wasn't a lot of other people there with that kind of experience. And so I actually got some bad advice from my biology teacher who said, don't study science, you'll never get a job. And
Wow.
So I sort of thought, well, what can I do? So I went off to uni and in Brisbane, and I did 2 years of town planning because I thought, well, I can write plans for parks and national parks. And one of my units I was studying, there was a woman who was a zoologist who'd come in to do some work on, planning for roads through nature reserves or something like that. And I just saw her speak and I thought, this is what I want to do. So I changed to science and I loved it. I chose plants, I think, because I didn't want to dissect animals. I've always had a real feeling for plants. Like, I love them. I'm not a great gardener. I like the idea of gardening, but the way plants function, the way that they have to survive in one place, they can't move away from fires and droughts. Things like that have always really fascinated me. And so I got on the pathway and I did my degree and I did my honours degree. I went and worked for a couple of years, but then I came back and did my PhD and then was on an academic career path and worked in universities for about a decade after that.
Okay, wow. And I think it was in the interview I read with the Australian Wilderness Society, you said something, or maybe it's even within the book, you mentioned the importance of identifying different parts, like different types of plants. So like, obviously you'll have the right terms for this, and I'm going to embarrass myself if I get involved in this. But I guess the gist of it is that were I to walk through my garden, there would be subspecies. Is that the right term?
Yeah. Look, Laurie, I will embarrass myself if I talk to anyone who's a botanist, who's someone who can identify plants. But yes, so when you think about, if you go to some bushland near you, you'll think about there's different parts of canopy. So there's the overstory, which are the eucalypts usually around Perth, or if you're in Banksia woodland, that'll be the Banksias. And then you'll have plants that grow on the understory, lots of shrubs, and then you'll even have the ground layer below that are grasses and little herbs and things. In my book, though, I joke quite a bit that I'm not very good at remembering the scientific names of things. So for me, though, when I moved to Western Australia, so I moved here about 20 years ago, I was just overwhelmed because the southwest of Western Australia is one of the most floristically diverse places on the planet. Mm. It actually has more species than a lot of tropical forests. And I think a lot of us living here don't know that we live in one of the most special places on the planet. And I was overwhelmed when I came here because I'm not a very good botanist. But as I write in The Memory of Trees, I found my way into understanding the landscape through eucalypts and where they grew and the forms of them. So that's a very long answer to that.
No, that's helpful. I was recently at the Margaret River Readers and Writers Festival, and the keynote speaker, Andrew Hagen, he talked about AI in his speech. And one of the things he said, but AI can't do this. And he wrote he read a passage he'd written about driving through the forest down the southwest. And I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that maybe the names aren't necessarily as important as the experience of one has within nature and the sense of joy and wonder around that. So I guess, is it interesting from your research, have you found yourself, I guess, do you feel dwarfed by that information? Do you feel empowered by it? What does it do to you on a sort of a biological level?
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation. So Cameron Muir, who's a environmental historian, said you don't need to know the names of things to know how a place makes you feel. And I agree with that. For me, I guess, I've got quite a logical brain. And so for me, that knowledge I find useful. And I had to use it in my profession. So I had to learn. But I don't think people need to know the names of things to go out and appreciate the bush. And I think if you want to learn, there's a lot of great tools now to help you learn. But for me, I still wander around in the bush and go, I think that's this. And I'll often take a photo of it and come back and try and learn it because I do like that. But I've been out with people like Steve Hopper and who is currently still at UWA, but used to be at the Botanic Gardens at Kings Park. And, he's extraordinary. He'll name everything for you. So I think it doesn't matter because for me, the main thing is that we're alive and aware to the world around us and how it's changing. And that's the emphasis. And so, as I'm sure everyone who's listening knows, we've just lived through a really hot, dry summer that's still continuing. And I'm sure people will be seeing the changes around them. Like the street trees are dying in Perth. In bushland, you can see things are dying. And it doesn't matter whether you know the names of those plants that are dying. You can see that they're dying. And I think you know that something's not good at the moment.
So talk us through the contributing factors to where we find ourselves today in terms of the literal impact. Who's bringing that or what's bringing that? And is there anything we can do to redress that or reverse that?
You mean in terms of what's happening with the tree dieback that's happening at the moment?
Sure. Well, I guess, and also in terms of clearing and things like that.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well,
you say
we could talk for hours.
Well, that's true. That's true. I guess the potted version, really, I guess industry and climate in particular are interesting ones to approach to that. So talk me through, I guess, your understanding and then we'll unpack it.
What's happening? Okay, so there are multiple things. So with what we're seeing with the summer, I think most scientists would agree that climate change is contributing to that. And so clearly we need to address climate change. And so the southwest of Western Australia is really at the coalface, and I didn't intend that pun, but we are in terms of climate change. Since the 1970s, there's been a distinct and measurable drop in rainfall. And I've spoken to people who grew up in Western Australia. I didn't. And they'll say, oh, yeah, in the winter school holidays, it used to rain all the time and things like that. So I think people have that memory of what it used to be like in their childhood. So we need to work to address climate change. But some other things that we can do to support forests and woodlands is like you're talking about. Like we also have one of the most extraordinary and rapid rates of land clearing anywhere in the world in the wheat belt. And so we can work towards restoring those ecosystems. And there's a lot of great work going on at the moment because if those places are connected to each other through space, it just makes them more resilient to the climate changes. So we need to think about looking after what we've got left, but also restoring areas that we've cleared. And it's a big thing. It's a big thing that will take concerted effort and it will take time and money. And there are some fantastic things going on in the Southwest as well. Really great world-class projects that are going on to try and redress some of the mistakes of the past.
And I guess the other part that plays an integral sort of part of the equation is First Nations relationships to the land, like that. So I thought it was interesting in my study that French botanists named the eucalypt, as Eucalyptus obliqua in 1777. But of course, that came into after a long period of history prior to that point. So much about the First Nations people's relationship with eucalypts in particular. Is there sort of a place where eucalypts fall within the greater fabric, or is it just the natural world is part of a much greater story?
Well, I'm always very careful, Laurie, to not speak for First Nations people about what they perceive, how they perceive the ecosystems to work. I think one of the things I wanted to write about in the book, and I come to that towards the end of the book, was a difference between how we've got this sort of post-Enlightenment view of the natural world as resources for us to take versus, and not just First Nations people in Australia, but if you read, for example, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, these deeper ideas of respect and reciprocity towards the natural world. So that was something I was privileged enough to participate in a couple of events while I was writing the book. So one of those was a cultural exchange camp at a place called Nauanup, which is down sort of about an hour and a half northeast of Albany in that Mallee country, led by Uncle Eugene Eads. And I also got to help out in a prescribed burn led by Arnie Lynette Knapp in sort of a similar area. And yeah, again, those ideas of respect, great care, and I guess a slowness that we don't, from this sort of Western culture we're losing, where everything gets faster and faster and faster. But the other thing in terms of, so when we were doing that burn, we were very careful about the trees, because the trees were so important out in those landscapes where there's not a lot of shade. So when we were burning there, we did everything we could to make sure the fire didn't damage the trees. And I guess, and I'm thinking about your question too, I also got the chance to go out into the Great Western Woodlands and talk to Les Schultz, who's a Nudgee cultural authority. And the Great Western Woodlands there too, the woodland eucalypts are incredibly important to Nudgee as well. And again, they protect them from fire. They do everything they can to protect them from fire, which is kind of in contrast, I guess, to some of the management techniques that we have in terms of prescribed burning. So again, that's a very I don't want to say hot topic, but it's at the moment very much contested.
Yeah, and I really appreciate what you're saying about, I guess there are two interesting things there. That idea of something that's there to be utilized, for lack of a better phrase, but also this idea of it being a communal thing rather than something which an individual enters and gets their fill from, which is sort of an idea too, this individualistic idea that you would go there and you might even take a bit off the tree for yourself to, as a memento. So I think partly that capturing thing is really interesting with Western society too, especially when it feeds into things like social media and stuff, that you're capturing the experience rather than contributing to it. So that's an interesting one. And I guess the other thing you mentioned in your interview with the Australian Wilderness Society is that your main concern is not necessarily the extinction of the forest, but the elimination of an experience that once was in that particular landscape. I was really interested and captivated by that. So talk a little more on that.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a lot of focus on rare and threatened species, which is justified. But, I don't know if people have heard the story of species like the passenger pigeon, that there were millions and millions of them in the sky, and they used to be hunted in the US. And then the population just collapsed and they went extinct. And so often if we neglect things that are common around us until it's too late, then they can just disappear. And so we have a lot of focus in Australia. Our legislation deals with things that are rare and threatened, but it doesn't deal with keeping the ecosystems around us healthy and robust so much. And so a lot of the eucalypts that I'm writing about in the book, they're not rare or they're not threatened, but they're so important to our sense of place. And I think as things change with the climate, we see trees dying. I think about what that means for us, and not just our relationship with those places, but also how we feel in ourselves to look out on places that are dying. And we can get away from it a bit when you live in the city, for example. I mean, we use a lot of water on gardens and things like that. But when you're driving through places that you can't water, so it's this experience of the natural world as an abundant and healthy place that I think is important for us as humans. Well, it's important for me as a human. I'm not sure if it's important for all humans, but for me, that's important to my own mental well-being. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think you're right. And I also think that what might be inherently important to you might be important to others too. And so in an information-heavy world, books like yours are really important to have that conversation because the dominant conversations aren't typically ones about this kind of thing. They're news sort of cycle-based and things like that, whereas this is a very significant universal thing we're talking about here. Now, you did mention dieback before, and I scurried away from that out of fear because I didn't know what I was talking about. So do you want to talk me through a little bit about what
dieback? Yeah. So dieback's just a general term for trees dying, I guess not through a particular event. And so what we're seeing at the moment in the forest around us where the trees are browning off is called dieback. So the tree might not be dead, but it's certainly unhealthy. And so that can be caused by lots of things. It can be caused by insect outbreaks. It can be caused by drought. It can be caused by a combination of things. And so what we're seeing around us now with trees dying in Jarrah Forest is a dieback event. And so some of those trees might recover and some of them might actually die. So that's what dieback is.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. I went to an open mic poetry event one time a few years ago, and someone did a 15-minute poem on dieback. But what you described to me there was much more vivid and illustrated than the poem, not having a go at that poet. Now, you were supported in writing this book via a Dahl Fellowship from Australia. What did the support entail, and what were the requirements in terms of the work you had to produce?
This is interesting, Laurie, because I applied for the Dahl Fellowship without any intention of writing a book. I wanted to explore some of these papers and interviews with scientists that I'd seen talking about the fact that eucalypts were in trouble, and it all kicked off with a paper that was comparing trees to coral reefs and saying both trees and corals are long-lived and they live in one place. And the authors were saying, well, we're seeing corals dying back now with increasing and more severe droughts. Maybe the same thing will happen to trees. They just can't survive in those conditions anymore and they'll die. And so all of this kind of came together. And so the Dahl Fellowship is a fellowship from Eucalypt Australia that's to support projects that are involved in eucalypt conservation or eucalypt education. And so when I applied for it, I thought, I might be able to write some stories for The Guardian. Like that's what I had in mind. And so I put together a proposal, and that was what I said my outputs were going to be. And what I really wanted was to have some funding to travel, because the way I like to write is I really want to go out into the landscape and talk to people in the landscape. I mean, I can interview people over the phone or over Zoom, but to be out with people in the landscape is a really powerful thing, I think. And so that the fellowship gave me money to travel around the Southwest, and unfortunately it was the pandemic and the borders were closed, so I couldn't travel further afield. But that funded all of my travel out into the Great Western Woodlands and all around the Southwest, and also gave me some money to support the writing. I didn't actually have a book idea at that stage, but then I thought, oh, maybe I do have enough for a book. I wasn't sure. And through a lot of serendipity, I was introduced to my publisher, Sally Heath at Thames and Hudson. And then it went from there. So the fellowship gave me the financial backing to travel, but it also made me feel confident that I had an idea that people were interested in. And once I had that confidence that this idea was something worth pursuing, I thought, oh, maybe I can take it further. So it led to a lot of things, and it was fantastic. Yeah.
And that's interesting. Do you think, because I wonder if a lot of writers struggle with that there is the commitment to a project, but it's so integral to get someone coming in and going, this is viable. It's almost like we have the vision, but the belief is almost a separate entity as to how this might actually become a thing. It's super exciting that your book's now in the world, and congratulations again on having the book shortlisted for the Book of the Year. I guess to close out the interview, towards the end of the book, there's a particularly beautiful wisdom imparted about trees as passed on by Uncle Noel Nannup. Can you read from that section as a way to end our discussion and perhaps generate other equally exquisite and inclusive meditations? Wonderful. Thank you.
I think of a story Uncle Noel Nannup tells about how the nutrients from the shed skin of his ancestors would be taken up by she-oaks, their DNA becoming part of the trees. When the she-oaks move in the wind, and if you know how to listen, you can hear the voice of every person who has ever lived, he says. The wind surges for a moment, and the tops of the trees around me bend forward and retreat in turn. As they each bow towards me, I feel like a stranger welcomed into a family reunion. Hello, I whisper back.
Viki, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Laurie.